Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book, the show comparison for the Expanse Season 3, Episode 8, It Reaches Out. This video is a part of a series of videos where I compare the Expanse TV show to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinion on how well these adaptations work. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for the Expanse up to the end of Season 3. If you haven't seen all the way to the Season 3 finale, including the finale, you will not want to watch this video, otherwise some things will be spoiled for you. However, if you have seen all of Season 3 but haven't yet read the novels, not to worry, this video will not contain spoilers from the novels that happen beyond Season 3, so you will be safe from future spoilers. So our episode begins on the Thomas Prince with the heads of the ship watching a recording of Mineo flying into the ring and splattering. Kavold is there, as is a naval officer named Commander Stanton, and for some reason Pastor Anna is there too. Kavold speculates on what happened to Mineo and is curious why his ship is perfectly intact while he is ripped to shreds. Stanton simply complains about the Belters, saying how foolish it was to send in manned probes, but Anna objects, saying that it wasn't a probe, it was just some kid trying to impress a girl, and he replies, well, I hope she's impressed. Kavold states that Mineo entering the ring triggered something, and then speculates that perhaps the ring isn't an entrance but an exit. Kavold then asks Anna if she thinks her god has revealed himself, and she replies that she doesn't know, but if they're going to meet God as a bunch of angry fools, then perhaps they should just turn their ships around and go home. So in the novels it was quite different. First of all, as I mentioned in previous videos, the order of events was different in the novels, as Mineo had smashed into the ring months ago, and the fact that it was activated was part of the reason the fleet was sent there in the first place, so we don't see them speculating or complaining about Mineo right after, as by the time Anna makes it out there, the ring activating is old news. Secondly, we would never see Anna and the CIC in a senior staff meeting like this. She simply was just another guest out of hundreds on the ship. She carried no significance, and since she was our viewpoint character in the novels, we didn't see any important staff meetings like this. I suppose in the show she's Avasarala's emissary, which is why she's in a meeting like this, but they didn't really make that clear last episode when Kavold didn't even know who she was. And plus, I must say the science versus faith theme here seems rather forced, whereas in the novels it was much more subtle, so I'm going to give this a -3. So then we go over to the Rosinante, where we see Holden talking to himself, telling himself that he's just tired and stressed. He's obviously trying to explain why he saw Miller sitting in his bedroom and is trying to pass it off as just a hallucination. Alex then calls him and tells him he better get up here, and when he does, Alex shows him the recording of Mineo smashing into the ring and tells him that the ring just woke up, as it obviously didn't appreciate being poked in its sleep. Alex then says that his guess is a bunch of alien ships are going to come pouring out of the ring asking to see their leader. Holden asks if the slingshotter's ship went out the other side, but Alex tells him it did not. It went down a rabbit hole. Holden sighs and says this never ends. Monica then puts a close-up on Holden and asks him what he means by that, but he dodges the question and goes to get some coffee, telling her to talk to Alex since he saw it first. Alex says he wasn't one to believe in faith, but now that they just so happen to be at the ring when it gets activated, he thinks he does. So in the novels, as I mentioned, the slingshotter incident happened months ago. Further, Holden had been seeing Miller for a year now, so he was used to it by this stage, but you'll find that's a major difference in this episode. I'm not so sure Alex's talk about fate makes much sense, as they're at the ring because Monica paid them to go and investigate it. It wasn't just a wild coincidence that the ring just happened to turn on when they were there. I mean, they're going there to study it, so it makes it more likely they'd be there when something happened. But whatever. Anyway, I think this works well for what the show established, but isn't necessarily better than the book, so I'm going to give this a 0. So we then go to the Behemoth, where we see drummer Ashford and Naomi conferring in the captain's office. Ashford asks if the Inners blamed them for what the Slingshotter did, but drummer reports radio silence. Drummer says that if anything goes wrong, they'll take the blame, but if something miraculous happens, the Inners will just plant their flags and claim it's theirs and then go back to fighting with each other. Ashford then complains that he was promised by Dawes that he could be the cynical one on the ship. Drummer states that the Inners don't want them out there, and being out there was just their idea, and so they'll take the blame if anything goes wrong. Ashford gets upset and says, out there is their home, not the Inners, and then he storms off. Drummer then tells Naomi that being in charge sucks, but Naomi says she wears it well, and that they all have their role to play in the new Belter state. Drummer accuses her of parroting Fred Johnson, but Naomi tells her that he's not wrong. So we didn't get a scene like this in the novels with the three heads conferring, because Ashford and Pa went out of their way to keep Bull out of external matters. And when observing Naomi in the show, I'm reminded of a quote from Star Trek Generations: "He must be the only engineer that doesn't go to engineering." Only replace the he with the she. And that's Naomi in this show. Anyway, in the novels, we do get a scene where all the senior officers are conferring in a meeting, but it isn't just three of them, it's all the senior heads, and we mostly hear from a scientist who explains the ring. At this stage, the Martians have been sending probes into the ring for a while, since the Slingshotter incident happened a while ago, and they discovered all about how inside the ring there's a speed limit that if anything's going beyond the speed limit, it catches and disables it. So they even know what the speed limit is exactly. This was purposely withheld in the show until later, which will have impact on the episode, and I'll get into that later. But also at this meeting, Michio Pa reported that Sam had been siphoning off unauthorized energy from engineering. This was actually at Bull's request, so Bull tries to take the blame for it, but Pa doesn't let him, claiming that she's the chief engineer and it's her responsibility, so she relieves Sam of duty and orders Bull to confine her to her quarters, and Sam is outraged by this. This, of course, is Pa's way at getting back at Bull for spacing the drug dealer, as she knows Sam is his closest ally. It's also a way of punishing Sam for being his ally. Bull realizes that if he refused to comply with her orders, that would give her the excuse to relieve him of duty, which is what she really wants, so he goes along with it, and the whole time Ashford is smiling smugly. What occurred in the novels was a lot more intriguing than what happened in the books. That happened in the show, and it makes a lot more sense for a battleship on its way to a scientific meeting to have a scientific conference like this. So I'm going to give this a -2. We then go back to the Rocinante, where we see Holden in the mess hall getting some coffee. He hears a weird sound and turns to see Miller, who is glitching and being incoherent. Holden turns and asks if he's trying to talk to him, but when he turns back, Miller's gone and Monica Stewart is there, and she says yes, she's trying to talk to him. She tells him that miracles are happening just outside, and that this is no longer a story about the Rocinante. This is a historical event, and she wants to tell through his eyes, so wants him to stop holding back and to trust her. She tries to reassure him that she's not an artist, that she's a highly educated reporter and wants to do humanity a service by reporting on historic events. He then agrees, and as she turns to leave, she mutters to herself, "We're going to win so many awards." So in the novels, Monica's documentary was also originally about the ring, as it had been already activated at this stage. But she did also want to get Holden's perspective on it, which is why they specifically chose the Rosinante to ferry them out there. This is also similar to a scene in the novels when Monica complained that the Rosinante crew weren't being cooperative, and Holden agrees to be more cooperative. The thing about her muttering, winning tons of awards is an embellishment on the show's part to add humor, I guess. Whereas in the novel, she was more professional. And as for Miller's appearance, the incoherent ranting is what occurred before Mineo went into the ring, after Miller was a bit more coherent. But I think this works well for what the show established, so I'm going to give this a 0. So then we go over to the Sun Un, where Melba is just waking up after having killed Ren. Ren's hand terminal chimes as Stanley is trying to call him to find out where he is and what's taking him so long. Panicked, Melba tries to stuff his body in the compartment but finds that it doesn't quite fit, so she triggers her enhancements and then smashes his head and crams the body into the compartment. She then cleans up all the blood to cover her tracks and heads back to the ship. Now, in the novels, Melba didn't kill Ren on the Sun Un, which in many ways was more convenient and in some ways not. It's more convenient in the way that no one was looking for her or Ren, as they didn't even know that she was with Ren, so as far as anyone else knew, Ren simply disappeared and she had absolutely nothing to do with it. But less convenient as the way that Ren's body didn't simply explode with the Sun Un. So Melba had to hide his body. What she did was embodied the body in her bathtub to break it down to raw materials and then put the remains in a duffel bag that she hid in her locker. She recycled Ren's hand terminal, and after a few days she reported Ren was missing. The authorities were investigating a fifth member of her team, a man named Bob, whom Bob and Ren were apparently both in love with the same man, so the authorities assumed that this was a crime of passion. But those on her team doubted it, as Bob was a good man. As a side note, I once heard that having 3 of the members of Melba's team named Stanley, Ren, and Bob was a call out to the Expanse author's friend George R.R. Martin and his Song of Ice and Fire novels, as Bob, Ren, and Stanley were named after the Baratheon brothers from the novels and coincidentally the Game of Thrones TV show, Robert, Renly, and Stannis. I thought that was a pretty cool thing, but it's completely irrelevant here. Anyway, this created more of a worry for Melba, as she had evidence tying her to Ren's murder that she couldn't get rid of. She was just hoping that they would have no need to search her things so she wouldn't get caught. Also in this scene, it is implied that the implants give Melba super strength, as she's able to smash Ren's head in half and cram the body into a space that wouldn't fit in normally. And as I covered in previous videos, in the novels, the implants did not give her super strength. It just heightened her abilities, made her think and see things much quicker and clearer than others, and took away her fear, which allowed her to use her own strength to become an effective, nearly unstoppable killing machine, but it didn't give her super strength. I think this works for the show's version just as well as it does for the books, as they both conveyed the emotional trauma that she suffered after having to dispose of the body of her friend. So I'm going to give this a 0. So then we go back to the Behemoth, where Ashford gets a bottle of liquor and brings it to Drummer and Naomi in the command center with 3 glasses and pours them each a glass. He offers a toast to Anderson Dawes and Fred Johnson for telling the UN not to try to turn the Behemoth around. Naomi and Drummer don't seem too enthused, so Ashford encourages them to raise their glasses and then makes a toast to Mineo, the foolish and brave rockhopper who gave his life for love. The 3 of them drink, then Ashford refills their glasses. He then says that babies in schools will be named after him for the next 50 years, but Drummer says if they're still around in 50 years. And Ashford shames her for not having more optimism, but Drummer says that all the optimists that she knows are dead. But Ashford points to Naomi and says, "What about this one?" Naomi raises her glass and says, "Guilty." Ashford then goes on to say that if Mineo never opened the ring, the inners would just be sitting outside, tapping on it for generations. Drummer says that she never remembered him talking this much before, and she takes the bottle and leaves with it to put it away. As she walks away, Ashford clanks glasses with Naomi and they share a drink. So there was absolutely no equivalent to this in the novels, as Ashford was a totally different character. In fact, knowing him, he'd probably flip out if someone tried to drink in the control center. The scene that is most similar to would be a scene where Bull goes to Sam's quarters after she's confined there and brings her a 6-pack of beer as a peace offering. She offers some of the beer to Bull, but he declines it, as it's implied that he's a recovering alcoholic, as apparently he was a drunk when Fred Johnson first recruited him into the OPA. Sam tells him that he's right about Pa, that she went after her so that Bull would lose all of his allies, and that as much as she wants to tell Bull to go put his dick in a vice, Dad'd be giving Pa exactly what she wants, so she's not going to do that. Bull says thank you, and Sam tells him to go put his dick in a vice. So, I didn't really think the drinking scene with Ashford was necessary. It adds a little bit to his character, but I think the scenes with Sam and Bull and their feud with Pa was much more interesting, so I'm going to give this a -2. So then we go back to the Rosinante, where we see Cohen wandering around the command center alone. Amos catches him there and says that he told him that this area was off limits and asks if he's deaf as well as blind. Cohen apologizes and says he needs to wander around for exercise. Amos suggests a treadmill. He then asks Amos if he should be holding out any hope. Amos gets close to him and says, "You should not," and then gently guides him out of the command center and closes the door. So this, of course, implies the sabotage that Cohen did to the Rosinante on Melba's behalf, and Cohen flirting with Amos was just a way to distract him and change the subject. In the novels, Cohen did sabotage the Rosinante on Melba's behalf, but it was not foreshadowed like this, and it was more of a shock when it was revealed, which I actually like better. And the whole flirting thing I thought was dumb, so I'm going to give this a -1. So then we go over to the UN fleet, where Melba is flying the skiff back to the Thomas Prince, and only Stanley is on board, and he's theorizing on where Wren is because he never returned. At first, he speculates that since Melba was an hour late and Wren's nowhere to be found, that the two of them hooked up, but then he dismisses the idea, figuring Wren's too old to get someone that young. He then speculates that Wren is drunk somewhere, sleeping it off, calling him the laziest man he ever knew. Meanwhile, Melba is visibly coming apart, completely affected by what she just did. He eventually tells Stanley to shut the fuck up, and he claims to just be joking, but then he continues to badmouth Wren. But Melba ignores him, saying that Wren's a decent person, much better than most people she met. As she prepares to dock with the Thomas Prince, she notices some blood on her hand and tries to rub it off, and in doing so thinks of Wren and how good of a person he was, and then thinks of how she just killed him and smashed his body, and she begins to cry. While doing so, she completely forgets about the skiff and almost crashes. Stanley isn't too happy, as he had to grab control of the skiff to pilot them back to the Thomas Prince, and he isn't satisfied when she says sorry, as she almost got them both killed. But Stanley is completely oblivious to how emotionally distraught Melba is. So, as I already mentioned in the novels, Melba kills Wren on the Thomas Prince, so there's no scene where she has to fly back just after killing him. She does get emotionally distraught in front of others after having killed him, but this happens after it is announced that the Thomas Prince is going into the ring. Therefore, everyone else just mistakes the sorrow for fear. This scene in particular was really good, really well acted and really portrays visually the toll killing Ren took on her. Unfortunately, it wasn't nearly as earned as it was in the books, as Ren barely appeared and Melba wasn't shown to be particularly close to him, and Melba herself hasn't been established in the show very well. So I feel to get the full impact of this scene, you probably needed to have read the novels to understand who these characters are and why this affects her so much. Any scene of the show should stand on its own, but so all that has more to do with the pacing issues of season 3. The scene itself is actually quite excellent, so I'm going to give this a +2. So then we go back to the Resnate, where Holden is in the medbay testing himself for the protomolecule, but all the tests turn out negative. He's running a variety of tests on himself, trying to figure out why he's seeing Miller, but all the tests turn out clean. Miller then appears to him talking about doors and corners and how you have to clear a room first. Holden asks him why he's here, but Miller just recounts old stories of when he was a cop on series. When Holden yells at him, Miller seems confused and continues with his cop stories. When Holden interrupts him again, Miller says that he's just an investigator now. Holden then complains that he and Julie died on Eros when it collided with Venus, and Miller simply states that he doesn't want to talk about Julie. Holden begins yelling at him in anger until Amos walks into the room, and from his perspective, Holden is yelling at nothing. Holden is embarrassed, tells Amos that it must look kind of weird to him, but he's okay. Amos is not convinced and tells Holden that he's been through a lot recently and that if he needs to vent, it's okay. Amos also offers to listen to him, saying that he may not be good at giving advice, but he doesn't judge. Holden seems appreciative, but assures Amos that he's okay, or at least he will be. This seems to appease Amos, who leaves. Holden then checks the logs that recorded the medbay in his conversation with Miller, but Miller isn't on the recording, just Holden talking to nothing. So in the novels, most of these scenes with Holden doubting his sanity, wondering if he's seeing Miller, and coming to terms with what this means, this all occurred between books, as Miller first appeared to Holden at the end of book 2, and at the start of book 3 it's been a year, and Holden has been seeing Miller for a year this whole time, and off and on, and has already come to terms with it. However, during the year, Miller had said nothing coherent, certainly not as coherent as he is here. There was also a part in the novels where Holden mentioned Julie, and Miller said he didn't want to talk about Julie, but the context of the conversation was different. As for Miller calling himself an investigator, he didn't do this in the novels, but there were interlude chapters in book 4 that were said to be from the perspective of the investigator, which we learn is Ghost Miller, so the external narration of the novel refers to him as the investigator. However, in the novels, Amos never walked in on Holden like this, and at this stage is still unaware that anything is wrong with Holden or that he's seeing Miller. Naomi, on the other hand, knows all about Miller and has, of the start of book 3, completely believes Holden and never doubts him. I actually like seeing the initial reaction of Holden thinking he's crazy, something the novel skipped over, and it integrates this nicely into this part of the story. So I'm going to give this a +2. So then we go back to the Thomas Prince, where in the mess hall, religious leaders and crew are gathered listening to a priest talk. The priest is a man named Hector Cortez, or how he's also known, Father Hank. Father Hank is speaking in grandiose terms about how they are living in holy times and exciting times, and that this new business with the ring is nothing to be feared but to be embraced, as he says that they must all open their minds and their hearts. And just then a woman leans over to Pastor Anna, who's listening, and adds to Cortez's sentiments about opening their minds and hearts that they must also open their wallets. The woman who says this is Tilly Fagan, an extremely wealthy socialite. She talks about how her husband's company donates money to several of Cortez's mega churches as it helps him reach his many followers. This implies that Father Hank is also wealthy and prestigious, which would explain why everyone's listening to him now. Tilly seems quite friendly with this kind of humor, and Anna noticed that she's drinking and scolds her, saying that she promised that she would switch to coffee. But Tilly points out that she also has a coffee along with the Bloody Mary. Now, we are finally introduced to Father Hank and Tilly, two characters who are important in the Baden's Gate, and particularly in Pasta Anna's story. Hector Cortez, or Father Hank, becomes a very important figure who impacts the second half of the novel, whereas in the show he barely appears, and then they write him off the show much sooner, which in my opinion greatly decreases the quality of the last few episodes. But I'll talk about that when I get there. In the novels, it's Father Hank who is friends with Secretary General Gillis, not Pastor Anna. So Cortez is among the most prestigious and important VIPs, not Anna as in the show. Although in the show, Hector Cortez does seem to have some import. Tilly Fagan is also a rich socialite who likes to drink and has an eccentric personality that I think the show captures well. However, her show counterpart does look much younger than she's described being in the novels. And the scene in the novels that first introduces these characters does a much better job, in my opinion, as we see them meeting each other for the first time, as Cortez meets Anna and introduces her to some of the other priests at a party and is acting like an esteemed host with a booming voice until Tilly comes up to Anna and offers her a drink, which Anna declines, and then begins to question everything that Cortez says and implies that he has ill intentions, but Cortez tries to laugh off all of her remarks as jokes. Tilly implies that Cortez has the ear of the Secretary General because he helps him get elected. Cortez denies this, of course, saying that he's only Gillis' spiritual advisor. So although I like how they portrayed Tilly in the scene, to be frank, I think the show did a piss poor job introducing these characters, as those who hadn't read the novels would barely know they are being introduced to new characters, and they might even mistake them for extras and wonder who the hell this woman is who's talking to Anna. So I'm going to give this a -5. While sitting at the mess hall, Anna notices a woman sitting by herself who looks quite upset, and that woman happens to be Melba. When Melba leaves the mess hall, Anna follows her into the corridor and calls out to her. Melba's face is covered in tears, but she wipes them away before she turns to face Anna. Anna asks her if she's alright and if she needs any help, and it looks like Melba is eager to talk to her and confess everything to her and ask for help, but instead she backs off and says no, she doesn't need any help, and she leaves. Now, in the novels, Anna's encounter with Melba comes after it's announced that Thomas Prince is going into the ring. Melba was sitting with her crew talking about how Ren is missing and her crew leaves, leaving her behind feeling upset for killing him, but Anna mistakes her uneasiness for fear about going into the ring, so Anna goes over to her and tries to assure her that it's alright. Melba is so emotional at the time she mistakes this for Anna knowing what she did, killing Ren and destroying the Sun Un, so she gets upset and yells at her, and she thinks to herself that she's going to have to kill Anna, but her outburst attracts the attention of several Navy officers who prepare to intercede. And a small voice of rationale comes to Melba, and she realizes that Anna doesn't know anything, and killing her would only get her caught. In fact, if she doesn't calm down now, she could get arrested, in which case they would find her identity doesn't hold up, and they would also find the remains of Ren in her possessions. So she simply sneers at Anna that she doesn't know her, and then leaves. Anna, for her part, simply apologizes. It's interesting that the show took a different route with Melba wanting to confess rather than being angry at Anna. This sets up for what they do with her later, and I think it makes her a bit more sympathetic character in the show, which I thought was a nice touch. So I'm going to give this a +2. We then go over to the Bersenate, where we see Cohen using the camera to spy on Amos and Alex as they have a private conversation. Amos is telling Alex, who thinks there's something wrong with Holden because he's talking to himself, but Alex dismisses it as normal. Amos muses that he spends half his time talking to the ship, so he's the wrong person to ask. Amos then tells him that Holden ran several medical checks on himself and he read the logs. Alex shames him for doing so, as that's a breach in privacy, but then asks what he found. Amos tells him that Holden checked to see if he was infected with the protomolecule 35 times, and each time it came up negative. They have no idea why he's doing that. Alex brings up how the XO on the Canterbury went space crazy and wonders if that's happening to Holden. Meanwhile, while they are talking, we see Cohen open up a panel on the Rosies with computer chips, and he takes one of the computer chips out and replaces it with his own. So in the novels, we didn't get a scene like this, as Holden never acted crazy around Amos or Alex. He confided in Naomi, and that kept him sane. So I do buy that in a scenario where Naomi wasn't there, that he'd find it a bit harder to deal with. Plus, Alex brings up the XO of the Canterbury, referencing the first episode of the show, and that event did not occur in the novels either. As for Cohen's sabotage, in the novels it wasn't anything so obvious, but rather he attached the device to a lighting fixture in the laboratory. Amos had noticed that something was wrong with the light in the laboratory, but had deemed it as low priority, so hadn't tried to fix it. However, this wasn't explained as Cohen's sabotage until after the sabotage was committed. I think this is the logical conclusion of how these characters would behave if the timeline did turn out the way that the show portrayed it, and if Naomi was no longer on the ship. And I think this scene effectively helps ramp up the tension, so I'm going to give it a +2. So then we see Monica Stewart interviewing Holden, who's very emotional and getting into some personal details about how he misses Naomi, but Monica tells him to cut the bullshit and get into why he really called her there. Holden asks her if she thinks someone's hopes and fears can physically manifest things. She says if those hopes and fears are powerful enough, especially if they are a result of synchronicity. This sparks something in Holden, and then he goes to Monica and asks to see the timestamp of the exact moment the slingshotter went into the ring, and then show him what he was doing at that exact same moment. And apparently, he finds out it was the exact same moment that Miller appeared to him. He freaks out, but Monica has no idea why, and when she asks Holden, he refuses to answer and instead just shoves her out of the room against her protests. As soon as she leaves, Miller appears to him again. This time, Holden is more interested in what he has to say and asks to explain the story with the gangsters. Miller asks him if they've met before. Holden, confused, asks Miller if he knows that he's here. He answers, sometimes. Holden then asks him, why him? Why is Miller appearing to him specifically? Miller says it's because he has a ship. Holden is a tool that goes places, and Miller is a tool that finds things. Holden reaches out to touch Miller, but Miller shakes his head no, so Holden retracts his hand. So in the novels, Holden doesn't put it together that when Miller appeared to him more coherent than ever, with a warning, was the exact same moment that the slingshotter went into the ring and told 2 days later, so that much is in line with the show. Now, Holden never had an exact conversation like this in the novels, but at one stage Miller does tell Holden that the reason he appeared to him is because he has a ship. I thought this scene was amazingly well acted by Stephen Strait here to show how much Miller appearing to Holden is messing with his mind. Nothing we got to see in the novels in such raw detail, so I'm going to give this a +4. We then see Melba on the Thomas Prince in a locker room looking upset and uncertain as she holds the trigger to the bomb that she planted on the Sun Un in her hands. But she gets a look of determination and then presses the button, and then in space we see the Sun Un explode. We then go to the Behemoth, where Ashford and Drummer go to the command deck where they are watching a recording of the Sun Un explode, and they speculate on what caused the explosion. Ashford muses that it doesn't look like a reactor malfunction, but it definitely isn't a missile. We then go to the Thomas Prince, where we see a group of dignitaries, including Pastor Anna, Tilly, Father Hank, Cavord, and Commander Stanton, watch in horror as the Sun Un explodes on the view screen. So in the novels, Melba never wavered in her decision to destroy the Sun Un. It wasn't until after she did it that she started to have doubts. And on the Behemoth, the novel followed Bull's reaction to it, as he was curious as to what happened, but his immediate concern was how people on the Behemoth would react. Also, he was expecting the UN to take this poorly, so he ordered the ship to be put on lockdown. I love the way it was portrayed in the show. This medium has the advantage of being able to quickly cut between reactions, so we get all the various groups react instantly to this shocking tragedy, and I think the way it was executed here was a brilliant piece of editing, so I'm going to give this a +3. So then we go back to the Rosinante, where Holden is continuing his conversation with Miller. When Holden tells Miller that he appeared the exact moment the ring was activated and asks if the ring is using Miller to get to him. Miller then says that it reaches out 113 times a second. It reaches out and it finds nothing, so it creates the investigator, and then it kills the investigator and creates the investigator again and again until the investigator finds a door. Holden is confused and asks what he wants from him, and Miller all of a sudden snaps out of his musings and acts like old Miller again and starts telling an old cop story. This time, Holden is listening intently. Miller tells the story how he was with a rookie going into an unlicensed brothel, and how he told the rookie to check his doors and corners because he doesn't want to rush in with his dick hanging out. And then Amos interrupts by banging on the door, telling Holden that they need him now. Holden tries to ignore Amos, but he keeps banging and says that he'll get a crowbar if he has to. And then when Holden turns back to Miller, he's gone. So Holden and Miller never had this conversation in the novels, although Miller did keep repeating the same story about checking your doors and corners in a repeated fashion. However, the lines he said about the investigator is directly quoting the books, but it was never anything that Miller said. It was in fact narration of the interlude chapters in Book 4 that described the investigator, where they repeated these lines over and over again about creating the investigator and killing it over and over again. So these lines were for the reader. Holden never heard them in the universe. But I think it makes sense to put them in dialogue, and again, this was another nicely acted scene that establishes Holden's now accepting that Miller was sent from the ring, something that again happened off screen in the novels, which is nice to see, so I'm going to give this a +2. Holden then goes up to the command center and asks what's going on, and Alex reports about the destruction of the Sun Un. Amos speculates on what could have destroyed the ship when Alex detects a broadcast. The broadcast is of James Holden claiming responsibility for the destruction of the Sun Un and saying that he did it to illustrate that the OPA controls the ring and that any other inner ship that approaches the ring will face repercussions. We see Melba watching the message with a look of satisfaction, indicating that she manufactured the message herself. We also see officers on the Behemoth and the Thomas Prince watching the message play out. Back on the Rosinante, Alex asks Holden what he did, and Holden says that it wasn't him. Amos then suggests that he hasn't been himself lately and maybe he did something without realizing it, but Holden denies this, saying that he knows himself and he knows that it wasn't him. He then tells Alex to kill the message, but he can't as the Rosinante isn't responding to him. So in the novels, we are told very clearly that Melba manufactured this message and did in fact cost her a hefty sum to create a message that could fool the UN and Martian censors into thinking that it was authentic. Although, I do think it's clear enough that she created the message in the show, so I don't really have an issue with that. However, in the novels, Holden used to work for the OPA, and many people still associated with him as being a member of the OPA, even though he wasn't anymore, whereas his ties to the OPA in the show were always much looser, and he was never officially part of the OPA, so the message makes a little less sense in the context of the show. Also, Amos and Alex never for a second doubted that the message was a fake, but it does make sense in the dynamic of the show established, which I do think is a nice touch. But I don't think they did enough to make this message fit into the context of the show, so I'm going to give this a -2. On the Behemoth, Ashford warns that Holden is trying to take them down with them, and Naomi claims that it isn't Holden, but Ashford asks, well, who is it then? And Naomi says that it's a fake. They just need to examine the message, but Drummer says there isn't time for that and asks her to open a channel to the Rosinante. A crewman then informs them that the UN ships have target-locked the Rosinante and are scanning them. Ashford warns that they have to fire on the Rosinante to prove to the UN that they're not in league with Holden, otherwise they risk being destroyed. Drummer asks Naomi for the channel, but she reports that she can't reach the Rosinante and she needs more time to try. Drummer says they don't have the time and orders that they target lock the Rosinante. Naomi freaks out, claiming the Rosinante is being framed, so Drummer orders her to be removed from the command center, so Diago and a security man drag her away as she resists and yells at Drummer not to do this. So in the novels, things went down quite differently, as Bull was the one who had the idea to fire on the Rosinante, but as chief of security he wasn't in the command center, as that wasn't part of his duties. So he had to rush to get to the command center, and once he was there, Michio Pa yelled at him and told him that this wasn't his battle station and he needed to leave. But Bull ignored her and told Ashford that he needs to fire on the Rosinante. Ashford said escalation of violence wasn't warranted at this time, and he was communicating with Ceres, waiting to hear back from the OPA, which would take 4 hours. Bull realized that Ashford was foolish enough to actually hope that Holden was acting on behalf of the OPA. Bull then tries to reason with them that they need to immediately make it clear that Holden wasn't acting for them or with the OPA, otherwise they risk being destroyed by the UN and Martian fleets. Ashford refuses, but in surprise to everyone, Michio Pa backs Bull up, telling Ashford that he's right, they need to fire on the Rosinante. So the change in the way the characters behave makes sense, as Ashford is portrayed as a more experienced and reasonable one in the show, and it makes sense that Naomi would freak out like she did because she's so connected to the Rosinante. The novels didn't have a counterpart for that, so it was less about whether to kill Holden and more about Bull knowing the right thing to do and trying to convince Ashford, who was too incompetent to see it, and he let his hatred of the Inners get in his way. But the change in tone makes sense for the new dynamic established for this show, so I'm going to give this a 0. So then we go back to the Rosinante when Alex announces that the UN has target locked them and they realize most of their systems have been sabotaged, including communications and weapons. Alarms go off as the Behemoth target locks them. Amos calls out that of course the Behemoth would target lock them. The OPA has to distance themselves from them. Alex starts maneuvering the ship. Holden asks what he's doing, as they can't outrun a missile, but Alex says that they don't have to just sit there and take it. Holden then gets this funny look on his face and all of a sudden starts running away. Amos follows after him, asking where the hell he's going, as he physically tries to hold Holden back. But Holden breaks free and says that he just needs the men alone. He goes into an airlock and shuts the door, and Amos screams through the other side that he doesn't want to scrape him off the wall. But Holden asks, and all the time that they've known each other, how many times has he asked Amos for anything? Amos answers, none, so Holden says he's asking him for something now. Just give him 1 minute alone. Amos agrees for 1 minute, and Holden says alone and then walks off. So in the novels, when the Rosinante is target locked, they're all more on the same page, and they do all strap in. At first, they fly towards the behemoth, thinking since it's OPA they wouldn't target lock them, but that turns out to be wrong, as the behemoth does target lock and fires a missile at them. They then go towards the Martian fleet to hide, but the Martian fleet doesn't take too kindly to that, and they start target locking him. So Holden never feels the need to run and ask Miller what to do. He pretty much tries to figure out for himself, and eventually he does. So the show's version is way more intense. It was brilliant having Holden being slightly off kilter and seeing Miller while this crisis was going on, and added to the moment where he asked Amos for a favor, really proving how close they've grown, was a major moment, especially for the show where these two characters didn't get along at first, and it shows how far they've grown in the most exciting way ever. So I'm going to give this a +5. So then we go back to the behemoth where security men who are holding Amy back put their hands over her mouth to stop her from yelling at Drummer to stop. Drummer then communicates with the Thomas Prince, and the captain questions them at first, saying that they open the ring and then they blow up one of their ships, and they have the gall to claim they didn't know anything about this. But Drummer insists that they had nothing to do with either event, and they will take care of the Rosinante themselves to clean up their own mess. The captain gives her 1 minute. An officer then calls out that the Thomas Prince has opened its torpedo bays, and Ashford points out that he gave them 1 minute, and 1 minute is all they're going to get. The officer then announces that they have a target lock on the Rosinante, so Drummer orders that they fire. But as soon as they do so, the lights turn off as power goes down. Drummer asks what's happening, and the officer announced that it was a grid overload, and they need to divert more power to the weapons. Ashford scoffs about this being one hell of a battleship. So in the novels, Ashford never communicated with the Thomas Prince. They were never told by the UN that they would fire on them, but they did start acting suspiciously, and through the urgings of Pa and Bull, two enemies who were united on this issue, Ashford took their advice and gave the order to fire. But the power did go down like it did in the show, but thankfully the missile did not get stuck in the launch bay, but the power did remain out. And that's when Bull asked Pa to return the chief of engineer to duty, and Pa gave him permission to do so. So both versions work, but the show's version is slightly more intense, so I'm going to give this a +1. Back on the Rosinante, Alex announced that for the moment they have the Rosinante slinking away, but they'd better strap in by the time he needs to maneuver. In the airlock, Holden is rocking himself back and forth, repeating doors and corners, willing Miller to appear. When he looks up, there he is, and Holden freaks out, yelling at Miller to give him something. Miller just looks up with intent and says, "If you go into a room too fast, the room eats you." As Holden gets a look of realization as he gets what Miller is saying. But then the behemoth launches their missile, and Alex starts maneuvering the ship, which throws Holden and Amos around as they are not strapped in. So in the novels, as I mentioned, Holden doesn't go to talk to Miller, and instead tries to navigate through this himself, and is also strapped in, so everyone is strapped in, so this isn't an issue. You don't have a conflict with Amos having to trust Holden. I think all these added elements made the show far more exciting, and Stephen Straight's acting here is simply superb as he's calling out to Miller to give him something, and the way that Miller is shot is just beautiful. The scene gives me goosebumps every time. It was just so well done, so I'm going to give this a +5. So then we see Amos help carry Holden back to the command center, where Holden tells Alex he needs to slow down He tells Alex to go for the ring, to do a hard flip and burn and a massive deceleration just before entering the ring, and Alex says no fucking way. Amos, who is sitting right next to Holden, asks him how he knows about the ring, and Holden tells him that Miller told him. Amos then tells Alex to do what the captain says, so Alex agrees but yells that it's going to be tight. We then see Drummer and Ashford on the Behemoth watching the Rocinante doing its maneuvers, where Drummer points out that it's going for the ring. Then on the Thomas Prince, we see a lot of people gathered in the CIC watching the Rocinante, where Pastor Anna asks what he's doing, and Commander Stanton says that he's dead. No doubt thinking that he'll end up like the slingshotter as soon as he hits the ring. The Rocinante do their hard flip and burn, and everyone passes out from it. When Holden wakes up, he finds they're all still alive, but now are inside the ring. An external shot shows the Rocinante in the ring, and the missile is there as well, but the missile is frozen and no longer speeding towards them. So in the novels, the ring and the missile is, in the novels, funnily enough, Miller didn't tell Holden to go into the ring. Holden came up with all that himself, as once he knew they had nowhere else to hide, he sent Alex a flight plan to do a hard flip and burn and massive deceleration, and Alex executed it without question. And when Holden woke up on the other side, Miller appeared to him and scolded him for entering the ring the way that he did, saying that I said, check your doors and corners, and what do? You come charging in the middle of the room with your dick hanging out, you lucky son of a bitch. Which is ironic because it means when he was saying doors and corners, he meant the exact opposite of what he meant in the show. Also, the major difference is that in the novels, everyone was already aware that there was a speed limit inside the ring. So the incident with the slingshotter happened months ago. They had time to study it, at which time the Martians had sent dozens of probes into the ring and calculated the exact speed limit one could safely go inside the ring and not be caught by it. However, no one had sent a manned ship in yet, so Holden was the first to do so out of desperation. However, the show's version was much more exciting, and I actually loved how they tied Miller appearing to their current predicament. It really upped the stakes, and this scene is one of the most exciting scenes in the entire show, so I'm going to give this a +5. So my final adaptation score for It Reaches Out is a +18. It started out with a low score, not that I didn't like the first part of the episode, I did, but it just didn't keep pace with the novels. That is until the ending, which was amazing, probably one of the most suspenseful and exciting endings the show has ever had. And all the Holden and Miller scenes were absolutely amazing. Stephen Strait as Holden did an absolutely great job playing Holden losing his mind, but still being right all along. It was a thing of beauty. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for The Expanse Season 3, Episode 8. I'll be back in about a week for my book-to-show comparison for Episode 9, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. Also be sure to check out my channel for more videos on The Expanse and many other shows like Star Trek, Lost, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.